Okay, so we're going to talk today about the ending of davening here, but I wanted to finish off one more point that I forgot to mention yesterday. We were talking about Pitam Aktoris, about the incense and the order of the incense. So there was a rule that you were only allowed to offer incense once in your life. This is actually, Mr. Cohen, this relates to your question earlier, right before davening, how they divided the work between all the Kohanim, the priests. So I mentioned that there was a raffle. They would cast lots every day, and that's how they would determine who got to do what. I mean, eventually, that's how it eventually ended up. It didn't start out that way, but that's eventually where it got to. But there was one exception. The offering of the incense was something that was you were only allowed to do that once in your life. So if you were lucky with the lots, you might be able to do different, various services in the temple multiple times in your lifetime. But incense, once you did it once, you couldn't do it again. The reason for that is the incense was a very, very special part of the service. And also, it's taught that the incense is a skula for parnasa, that those who would offer the incense would become wealthy. So because they wanted to spread the wealth around, so you're only allowed to do it once. Interestingly, this idea of offering the incense and doing it once actually is expressed in halacha practically today, because there's a halacha. It's that a person should can only serve as a sandik one time per family. So if there's a family, let's say one of your children is having babies, and they've had a few sons, and they honored you with being a sandik once. So the custom is that you're not honored with being a sandik a second time in the same family, once only per family. And the reason for that is because when you're a sandik, it's like you become like the altar on which the incense is being offered, and because you're the sandik, you're assisting in it. It's as if you're bringing the incense, and just as in the temple, the incense you're only allowed to bring it once in your life. So the same per family, you can be a sandik multiple families. There are some people that like to, but because of that segula of wealth, like to go around sponsoring brisson for people and being a sandik multiple times. So that you can do, but within a family, it's customary to do it only once. So why do I mention that? Because here we have Pitam Aktoris here is right at the end of davening. And we're at this point now where we're transitioning out of davening and looking at our watches and saying, it's time to get to work. I've got to beat the daily commute. I've got to get to work on time. And we're starting to think about business. So one of the final things we say in davening is that the Ketira is offering the incense. And we recognize that, hopefully it reminds us that our success in the rest of our day, in our careers, the rest of our lives, is all predicated on the time we spend studying, the time we spend davening, the time we spend with God. Just as wealth is not the product of your hard work and dedication to your craft and to the good, your good skills and talents and intuition. Obviously, it's a part of it, but ultimately the blessing comes from God. So where does the blessing come from? From offering the incense. That's what ensures financial and monetary, material success. So before we head out of the synagogue, before we start heading to work, we say the Pitam Aktoris, which serves as sort of a blessing in a sense for us to be successful in the rest of our day, but also really more importantly, I think it serves as a reminder that our bread is ultimately buttered by God. And then we conclude the davening right before Aleinu with these two passages here on page 79. Tana Devei Eliyahu was taught in the Academy of Elijah the Prophet. And then another one, which is Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Elazar said in the name of Rabbi Chanina. These two teachings, which actually can be found at the end of, actually the last teaching, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Chanina, which is the end of multiple tractates of the Talmud. And so these two teachings employ a method of Torah study and extrapolation of ideas. One of the methods through which the sages develop their exegesis is through what's called an al Tikrei. Al Tikrei means don't read it. What does it mean? Don't read it. So they would look at a verse in the Torah, they would see a word, and then they would say, don't read the word this way, read it another way. And then they would reread the words. Why could they do that? We've talked about in the past the fact that in Hebrew, the language doesn't have any vowels, right? It's all consonants. So technically, you can just make up your own vowels for the word. Now, obviously, you're just making something, you're making up words. But sometimes there are two words that are pronounced differently. The vowels are different, but the letters are the same. and so except that they're a little bit more liberal also, not just with the exact consonants, certainly not with the vowels, but even with some of the consonants they'd be a little looser. But the point is that you can read words in different ways. So in the first one, and now this is a this doesn't mean that it's easy to corrupt the text, God forbid, this way. But what it really means is they had teachings, and then they would look to apply them into a verse. They'd find a verse, and they would say, it's debated among the sages exactly, commentaries, exactly what the purpose of the Al Tikrei function was. Maybe it served as a reminder that they had a teaching, a certain idea, a certain value, a certain ethic, and they wanted to remember it, so they employed Al Tikrei, where they looked at a verse, they remembered the verse, they remember. So they look at the verse and they reread the word, and that was a reminder of that value of that teaching. So that's one of the reasons behind this concept of Al Tikrei. At any rate, in the first one it says, it's taught in the Academy of Elijah the Prophet, that one who studies Jewish law all day is guaranteed that he has a portion of the world to come, right? So that's a teaching, right? Now, how do you remember that teaching? So they employ Al Tikrei. Halichos olam loy. The verse says, Halichos olam loy. Habakkuk says, right, that the ways of the world are his, right, which is really referring to God. And then he says, Al Tikrei halichos ela halachos. Don't read the word halichos, the ways, the conduct of the world. Don't read it that way, but read it halachot, laws. And so reread the verse instead of reading it halichos of the ways of the world are his, right, which is a reference to God, that everything in nature are all his. He creates them all, but read it rather halachot olam lo. Halachot, somebody who studies halacha, somebody who studies laws every day is olam lo. He gets a world to come. He gets a portion, he's guaranteed a portion in the world to come. The olam, the world to come, is his, lo is his. Okay, so that's one teaching. The Rebbe would always point out, I think it's based on the Shalah, that whenever we find the sages teaching in Al Tikrei, so it doesn't mean that their teaching doesn't come to negate the literal and actual reading of the verse and its own meaning, right? But it serves to sort of add to it. So I just mentioned that Al Tikrei is used somehow like a mnemonic, some kind of a reminder. It's a device that they use to remember their laws. But it really runs deeper than that. It's not just to remember the laws. It actually also deepens the understanding of the original verse, or complements the original literal meaning of the verse. So here, Alichos Olam Lo, Al Tikrei Alichos El Halach, is also, there's the connection, the ways of the world. When a person goes in his life, and he's in his ways of his world, meaning he's going through life as a regular human being. And whatever he does and whatever he encounters in life, he's always constantly asking, what does halakha say about it? Or what's the halakha in this situation, that situation? So that he's guaranteed a portion of the world to come. He's already living in the world to come. He's already living in a world that's higher and greater than the lower mundane physical world. Okay, the next one here, Rabbi Elazar says in the name of Hanina that the sages increase peace in the world, right? And here again we use this device of Al Tikrei to understand, to reread a verse. It says, "V'chol banayich limudei Hashem v'rav shleim banayich." All your children shall be learners of the Torah of God, and great will be the peace of your children, of banayich of your children, right? So you study Torah, and great will be the peace that results from the Torah study. And for who's there going to be the peace? Your children, who you teach Torah. So he says, Al Tikrei banayich ela bonayich. Don't read the word banayich, right? Don't read it banayich, your children, but read it bonayich, your builders, right? So they build the world. They build peace into the world. Okay. It ends here, and then it ends with a few other verses that talk about peace. So we see how the prayer ends right before Elena. This is really the ending of the prayer. Ends these teachings serve two purposes. One is it serves to the end of the prayer. We want to end with the note of peace, just like the Amida, right, which is the central part of prayer, ends on the theme of peace. Sim shalom tova uvracha. We end with peace, and the same is true. We want to end our prayers on the theme of peace, because we know that peace says the end of Mishnah is the end of all of Mishnah, that God did not find a better vessel for blessing than peace. So we want to end with peace to create the proper vessel. But another point is that we're supposed to go from the house of worship, from the synagogue, into the house of study, right, into the study hall. That's what it says. You go from prayer. You don't run from prayer right to work. You run from prayer. You go to study a little bit. That's what you're supposed to do. So here, already built into the service, we already have a little bit of study. Here we're studying passages by the sages. We already studied the Pita Makteris, the way the incense was developed, which is also a section taken from Mishnah and from Talmud. And then we read these two other passages from the sages, from the oral tradition. So this is a little bit of study. And what do we study about? We study about the idea of the value of studying law and the idea that study ultimately brings peace into the world, as well as obviously blessing to the world. Having studied these ideas, so then we conclude with the Kaddish D'Rabbanan. What's the Kaddish D'Rabbanan? The Rabbanan Kaddish, why is it called the Kaddish D'Rabbanan? So some might say because you need to be a rabbi to be able to read it. It's so long and complicated. But the reason it's called Kaddish D'Rabbanan is because it's a Kaddish where within the Kaddish, we know Kaddish is about praising God. Within the Kaddish of Kaddish D'Rabbanan, we actually praise the rabbis. So this was a Kaddish that was generally said after Torah study. After you finish studying in the study hall, they get up and they recite this Kaddish, which is both the aggrandizement of God as well as blessing, requesting blessing and praise for the sages. That's what we say on page 80, Al Yisrael V'Rabbanan, right? On Israel and on the teachers and on their students and on the students of their students and everybody who studies Torah, wherever they are. So that's why this prayer, Kaddish D'Rabbanan, it follows that study. Okay, let's continue now with today's chitas.